Hello, my name is Alta Price, and I'm here today with the author Isabel Fargo Cole, author and translator. Initially, we were doing this for the Festival Neue Literatur, and Isabel and I, along with five other authors from Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, would have been greeting the audience in New York. So we're very grateful to the Sant Jordi Virtual Festival for including us in this virtual festival. And I'm coming to you today from Chicago. Isabel is in Berlin. And we're very excited to be bringing her work to you in the comfort of your own homes. So Isabel Fargo Cole grew up in New York City, received a BA from the University of Chicago in 1995, and has lived in Berlin ever since as a writer and translator. Her translation of Wolfgang Hilbig's Old Rendering Plant received the Kurt and Helen Wolf Prize in 2018, and her other translations of work by Wolfgang Hilbig and Franz Fuhrmann have been nominated for several awards. Since 2005, she has published short fiction and essays in German, and her debut novel Die grüne Grenze, Edition Nautilus 2017, was nominated for the Klaus Michael Kühne Prize and the prize of the Leipzig Book Fair. Her second novel, Das Gift der Biene, was published by Edition Nautilus in 2019 and selected for the 2019 Literatur Nord. From 2006 to 2016, she co-edited No Man's Land, an online magazine for new German literature in English. In 2013, she was a co-organizer of the initiative Writers Against Mass Surveillance. And with that, I would like to just dive in. We'll be having a bilingual reading of the sample. Das Gift der Biene is available in German. We will share with you links to purchase for the German speakers of you out there, to purchase it online. And Isabel will be reading to us from both the published German and the not yet published English translation done by Isabel herself. And then we'll have a brief discussion about the pleasures and perils of self-translation and what it's like to write about in an acquired language. So with that, Isabel, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alta. And yeah, I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to read in Spain all of a sudden. So hello to everyone in Spain, and I hope you're doing okay out there in this difficult time. Just going to say a few words about the novel. It's something of a sequel or kind of a next generation of my first novel, Die grüne Grenze, The Green Frontier, which is set in the border area of East Germany, the GDR, in the 70s and 80s. And The Poison of the Honeybee, or Das Gift der Biene, the narrator is an American recent college graduate who comes to Berlin in 1995 with a Fulbright fellowship and ends up finding her way into a community of former squatters who are living in a recently renovated former squat, and that has a salon and has all kinds of eccentric activities going on. And so the narrator, Christina, who has this fascination with East Germany, finds her way into this community through the kind of aspiring artist Maida, meets Wolfgang, whom we'll meet in this chapter. And also there's a kind of mysterious artist, Vera, who moves in later on, who has a mysterious past. And then some very strange things happen. But the main theme of it is Christina's trying to delve her way into the stories of all these young people who grew up in East Germany and have these very dramatic and often kind of traumatic stories in their past, which hark back to the first novel. I'm going to read just a little bit in German at the beginning of chapter 2, where Christina has just met Wolfgang and is being introduced into the house. So I'm going to read a little bit of German and then read the excerpt in a longer version in English. Ich schlief nie wieder in meinem WG-Zimmer. Meine Mitbewohnerinnen zuckten befremdet mit den Schultern. He could be a murderer for all you know. Meta half, meine zwei Taschen die Treppe hinaufzuschaffen. Hatte sie uns sogar verkuppeln wollen? Denn wer war letztlich mitgefahren? 3 Paare, 2 Schwestern und wir beide. Und es hatte nur den einen Schlafsack gegeben. Meta schien es aber nicht so recht zu fassen. Wolfgang sei ein wunderbarer Mensch. Wir saßen im Hof, während er die Flasche Meißner Wein suchte, die er seit Ostzeiten für den besonderen Anlass aufbewahrt hatte. Aber er habe schon seine Macken. Falls mir irgendwann die Decke auf den Kopf fallen sollte, könne ich jederzeit zu ihr. Ab Juli sei sie schließlich ein halbes Jahr in Israel. Ich könne ihretwegen dann auch bei ihr einziehen, im Salon nach den Rechten schauen. Auf jeden Fall hoffe sie sehr, dass ich so lange bleiben würde. Da stand er wieder und grinste schief. Darauf wollen wir trinken. And now in English. I never slept in the apartment chair again. My American roommates gave shrugs of disapproval. He could be a murderer for all you know. Maida helped me carry my 2 bags up the stairs of the yellow house. Had she meant to hook us up? After all, who'd gone on the camping trip? 3 couples, 2 sisters, and us 2. And there'd only been the 1 sleeping bag. But Maida seemed taken aback. Wolfgang was a wonderful person, she said. We were sitting in the backyard, waiting for him to find the bottle of Saxon wine he'd been saving for a special occasion ever since the time of socialism. But he had his little quirks. If I ever felt like climbing the walls, I could always come over to her place. In July, she was going to Israel for 6 months, so as far as she was concerned, I could move into the salon and keep an eye on things. Anyway, she really hoped I'd stay that long. He was back, grinning crookedly. Let's drink to that. The wolf, short and wiry, with shaggy gray hair, cooped up in a hoarder's home. Profession, private librarian. Employer, self. Why look for a job? The future is a thing of the past. Anyway, if he could start all over again, he'd want to be a cabinet maker, work with his hands. No university, no library science, no medieval studies, no 10 semesters without ever making the interim exams. Above all, no buying books. In East times, every West book, and West times, every East book that fell into his hands. No stacking books so prodigiously that his rooms turned into landscapes, wolf peaks, wolf ravines. Instead of bookshelves, he would have built a house. So far, he'd finished 1 room, the big one facing the street, had lined its walls with shelves of books 2 or 3 deep. No book stacks on the floor here, just his workbench and tools, and a jumble of furniture that he'd taken apart and put back together differently. All this is yours now, like something in a fairy tale. It left me speechless, the chaos, no, the system. Everything had its place. The preserving jars used as bookends, filled to the brim with watch gears and dials, the animal skulls on the windowsills, the cacti potted in antique typewriters, and me. Wolfgang kept the 2 small rooms in the back. Before the remodeling, that had been the whole apartment, with a hot plate for a kitchen and a toilet on the landing that his ex-girlfriend Claudia had squatted in 1998. He had come from Dresden to join her. Before that, he'd never dreamed of moving into a ruin. If a building wasn't being lived in, he figured the state had to have its reasons. Claudia made him question those reasons. But just a year later, she'd left him for a woman. Poor Claudia, the woman was just as bad as me. Maybe if we'd have more space, it's important for you to have your own room. I'll move my workshop into the basement, but the books have to stay. That was fine with me. 5 years in dorm rooms and apartment chairs with nothing but a computer, a lamp, 3 posters, and now a mosaic of book spines and pictures, fitted close as if a gap would make everything implode. Like my childhood room in New York. The pictures, Cranach, Schiele, Clay, could have hung in my room. But then there were the photos, the Saxon farmers, the grandfather in uniform who hadn't come home from the war, Wolfgang's fatherless father, and the hand-carved wooden shoes of the war's aftermath. And the wolf, just as black and white, a ghost. Like me, he'd been an ugly, sulky child, but his gauche 1970s were already faded. Scattered among the family photos were snapshots of the squatters and their visitors, with mohawks or mullets, dark lipstick and kohl around their eyes, fishnet stockings and torn jeans, showing bony knees or childishly plump ones, lounging against crumbling walls or in graffiti-covered stairwells, pictures like record covers of underground bands I wished I was cool enough to appreciate. Now they lived in the two immaculate yellow wings of the renovated building. The stairwell, still smelling of fresh paint, hinged the front building to the right-hand wing that jutted back into the empty lot. On the left, past the patio and the linden tree, the ramshackle back building stood surrounded by tall grass, like an otherworldly image of before. We lived in the front building, below us Dora with her little dressmaking shop, above us Eva and Bruno, unemployed Russian teachers who just moved in, and on the top floor the twins Susie and Mishi, who studied sociology and biochemistry and went dancing. Next door in the side wing was Holger, who sold junk. Downstairs from Holger was the workshop of Bilak, the frame maker. Upstairs was Torsten, who'd studied informatics with Holger, and above Torsten was his mother Carla, who'd once been an actress and now grew orchids. As we sat under the linden with the Saxon wine my first evening, they walked past one by one, eyeing me, and vanished in the back building. Wolfgang and Meta exchanged nods, and I followed them into the salon. The babble of voices embraced me, like their reminiscences by the campfire in Poland. Meta's life as a punk, Torsten's black market deals with West German records, Epa's and Bruno's hitchhiking trip through Siberia. Well, they said, at least the whole fiasco had given them some good stories. The fiasco, they meant the fall of the wall. The fiasco they meant was freedom. I'd listened in shock, sitting by the campfire. Was nothing sacred to these people? But Wolfgang had started griping. Just you wait, pretty soon you'll be kowtowing to the system. What does he mean? I'd wondered. I just wanted to go on listening, but Wolfgang insisted on giving me a proper introduction. He threw me to the lions, and Meta sat by and watched. This is Christina. She comes from Amiland. So they had my number right away. I was the system. Ever since 7th grade, I'd been saying democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. I'd never dreamed this cynical attitude could still leave me open to attack. But suddenly I was under fire from all sides. Meta watched, smiling to see how I'd hold up. The last defenders of the socialist German Republic seemed to be barricaded in this ruin. I had to convince them to surrender, or at least bring them the news that the war had ended years ago. Faced with their fierce resistance, I put up an unconditional defense of democracy. It had triumphed, after all. But for them, the triumph of democracy was the proof of its inferiority. Back then, they'd rejected socialism, but they'd changed their minds in the meantime. It had failed, like all things too good for this world. And democracy had prevailed, like all things cheap and vulgar. Wolfgang, though, allowed that democracy might redeem itself by failing too. Yes, its downfall was imminent. You could almost start feeling nostalgic. I got up and left so they wouldn't see me crying. 10 minutes later, Meta rang the doorbell. They were worried about me, and Wolfgang had turned around and started defending me. No, I didn't, he burst in after her. All I said was, the Amis will come out and talk, just you wait and see. We drank a round of schnapps that gave me a coughing fit. Don't worry, you'll get the hang of it, they said, pounding me awkwardly in the back. Wolfgang showed me photos, whole albums and boxes of them, a full briefing on the 29 years of his life. Kindergarten, Young Pioneers, Jugendfeier, a sort of socialist communion, elite high school. And all at once, the wolf in uniform, under a banner with the word Grenzerausbildungsregiment, border training regiment. In Berlin? No, on the Green Frontier in the Harz Mountains. I never would have recognized you. I gained 20 pounds in the army. He lapsed into a mumble, a barricade of dialect. That was his way of being honest. I was a nervous wreck, spent all my free time hanging around the kitchen. At least you could eat all you wanted. In the photo, he looked as if he'd burst with zeal, like a schoolboy called on stage to get a medal, believing for one moment that all the kids who'd always mocked him would suddenly admire him. The same year he'd been sent to the border, I'd been in Berlin, peering into the windows of the guard towers. What was it I needed to know A few years later, when I tried to write a story about a border guard, for example, how did they choose you for the border? Wolfgang didn't know himself. All he knew was if he'd refused, they wouldn't have let him study. But he'd never even thought of refusing. For him, the wall was the anti-fascist protective barrier. The unease set in once he was there. Once he met Kuno, who opened his eyes almost wordlessly to the power structures, the empty slogans, coercion for coercion's sake. The senselessness of their mission. If it was true that they were there to block the imperialist NATO invasion, then all they were was cannon fodder. They'd be crushed in an instant. But nothing had ever happened in that year and a half he'd spent at the border. Only once at the very end he'd had a bad moment when everything got confused, or maybe it was just a funny feeling. Someday he'd try to describe it for me. In my mind, I took down everything he said. But it was as if I couldn't see his face, as if someone on TV were confessing off camera. I smiled more and more understandingly, the person sent to obtain his confession. I put my shoes on. Where are you going? I have a lecture. I didn't hear a word of the lecture. I kept seeing Wolfgang as a shadow in a guard tower. Be careful what you wish for, I told myself. I blundered into another trap. Did I really need to know all this? Was it any of my business? After the lecture, I walked home wondering how to tell Wolfgang that I was sorry, but we had no future together. He was asleep on the couch. Grizzled head. He was asleep on the couch. Grizzled head, youthful chest, childish feet. He'd shed 20 pounds, and what else? I had to shake him awake. I thought you weren't coming back. No. I had a bad dream. I always have bad dreams on the couch. He was drenched in sweat. I flinched at the smell as if his fear might infect me, then checked myself. Poor Wolf. He relaxed when I covered his eyes with my hand. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's so wonderful to hear it from the author's mouth after having read it on the page. I'm struck actually hearing you read this morning, how timely it feels. And I would love to talk a little bit. You mentioned in your introduction to the book about the trauma that certain characters felt. And I neglected to mention, as I talked about Festival Neue Literatur, that this year, the theme for this year's festival was Turn and Face the Strange, which is very, very apt for your book. Beyond the idea that you mentioned, the word fairy tale came up, but this fairy tale aspect, one of the main characters, whose name is Wolf, the wolf, he throws Christine to the lions at one point. But the phrases that really struck me, a few of them, were the future is a thing of the past. So I suppose, I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the themes that you deal with in this book. I do want to talk about your experience of writing as an exophonic writer. I think authors like Jhumpa Lahiri, who's American and grew up speaking English, and is now writing in Italian, and several other authors throughout history have chosen to write in languages that they did not grow up speaking. So I would love to hear you if you have any thoughts or reflections that you want to share about that, and then not to throw too much at you all at once, but also you mentioned that he was part of the Young Pioneers, and I think especially in walking that line between the former East Germany. Your main character is in the newly unified Germany at that point, but also the linguistic baggage that both German language and English language, especially North American readers, bring to words like pioneers, or how you maintain the storytelling without feeling you need to editorialize too much or explain too much. So,
yeah, to get back to the thing that you started with about the timeliness, I really found when I was working on it, um, in the last couple of years, it was really interesting to revisit the 1990s, and with this kind of sinking feeling. The 1990s, for I think people who were my age back then or a little younger and really experienced that time as young adults, it was such an optimistic time for many people. I mean, for those of us in the more privileged world, definitely. There was a sense of opportunity, and somehow capitalism had won the Cold War, and everyone was going to be happy and have bananas and so forth. And the internet was going to be this wonderful, miraculous thing that was going to bring everyone together. And it was really very kind of a melancholy feeling going back and looking at that time, and this feeling of kind of utopianism and everything is possible, and realizing that in the 1990s there were a lot of kind of darker things going on, or just things that were being neglected, problems and tensions. In East Germany, there were a lot of tensions in East Germany that resulted from reunification. There was a lot of unemployment, a lot of just the disruption to people's lives, having this new system imposed on them, even if it had a lot of advantages. Their lives up to that point were kind of devalued. They were told that they'd been living kind of false lives in a dictatorship. So they had a lot of identity issues, and a lot of these things, were certainly talked about, but have really been festering a lot, and which we've been seeing in recent years, especially since the refugee crisis, which kind of, added new pressures that pushed a lot of these fractures in German society to the forefront. And so now Germans are to a large extent revisiting this time after reunification and kind of asking what problems were there, or that didn't get dealt with, and what kind of, there was maybe a certain naivety about how easy it would be to seamlessly transition into this new society. So that's kind of one thematic thing that came up when I was working on it, and kind of comparing it with the time we're living in now. And as for the question of writing in German, that came kind of naturally, because I moved here, and I didn't want to be the American who moves to a foreign city and hangs out with Americans, which a lot of people were doing in the 90s. And at least the cliche, that's the cliche that I believe in. But I really wanted to kind of go native, and I was really fascinated with this former communist world. So I really was I did kind of go native for a while. I was very immersed. And so my everyday life was taking place in German. It was dealing a lot with these specifically East German issues, and, sitting with my East German friends and hearing their stories, and lots of kitchen table arguments and so forth, and really taking in a lot of material, and then gradually trying to think of ways to work with that in a literary way. And I did, for quite a while, go on writing about these things in English, but at some point it did begin to feel like translating, like in English, just the word for, the Germans have a word for the whole transition from back then, which is die Wende.
Mm-hmm. Right. How do you
wall, and for reunification, and there's just no really good translation for it. So just with things like that, I found that, to write about that for an American audience, or an English-speaking audience, I would have to do a lot of explaining. I would have to take a perspective that's very kind of distanced, which I could, I can do that with this narrator because she's American. So when I was translating this excerpt, I did slip in little pieces of explanation here and there, in a way that seemed consistent with the narrator. So that's a freedom that I can take when I'm translating my own work. But it did, just for me, the material that I was working with kind of went naturally with using the German language to deal with it. but it's also interesting to try to transport this very specific material to English-speaking readers, which I've been doing, and the writers that I've been translating have been mostly East German writers.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. It didn't even occur to me that it would have felt to you, if you'd continued writing in English, that you were translating. So of course it makes sense that you continue to write, or you become. So which came first though for you? My impression is that, and maybe it happened, the publication schedules are different than the actual what you're doing in your daily practice of writing or translating. But I think I initially encountered you through your published translation work in English, and then was very excited when Die Grüne Grenze came out and was getting accolades in Germany for as a novel, for the story, but also the quality of the writing. So I guess it doesn't matter so much which came first, but so you mentioned sort of navigating those nuances in English, but is it, how much are you ever tempted to rewrite? I mean, so I suppose
Translating myself, or
yeah, and this is my I'm tainting this with my own experience as a translator, but I find that in any given book project, there are times when I encounter a sentence, and it's one thing to read it, and it's another thing to bring it into another language, that have it undergo that process. But I'll marvel at this, this beautiful or stunning or amazing sentence that the author has come up with, and then also tear my hair out because I feel it's impossible to bring into English, or it really resists being brought into English.
Yeah, I definitely take freedoms if it seems that I'm not, if I feel like in English the sentence wants to go in a particular way and a certain word sounds better, but it's further away from the content, but it fits for me. Obviously, I have the freedom to do that as my own translator, and sometimes things do just take a slightly different direction in English, or I don't know, maybe there's a certain alliteration that works in English, and so I'll take that and I'll go for that even if it adds something. So it's kind of interesting to see what it gives me the freedom to automatically move a little bit away from kind of literal, the word to word thing that you never end up doing anyway. But I can give myself that license, and I can be confident that it's corresponds to the author's intentions, even her later intentions.
Yeah.
But I try and it's a fine line between doing that and taking the easy way out, and leaving out things that are hard to translate. I hope I have the discipline not to do that.
Well, I have so many other questions, but I don't want to run too far over our time. I do have to ask, is this the actual building that the characters are inhabiting?
No, it's just I don't know, a photo that the cover designer found, and yeah, I really like it because it just visually it really captures the atmosphere of these Berlin houses that have all these courtyards going back, and also the novel is kind of it's kind of I can't think of the English word for verschachtelt. There's like a box inside a box inside a box. There's kind of story, and so that
the nesting doll effect
image kind of captures that.
Yeah. Well, Isabel, thank you so much. So I want to wrap up on this note. You mentioned that in a way this revisits another phase in the lives of the characters from your first novel. Do you anticipate, is this going to become a trilogy in any way?
Not at the moment. I mean, at the moment, I have a lot of material for various essays that I'm working on now, and that should keep me for a while. But who knows? There are a lot of loose ends in the two novels that I might be tempted to pick up at some point.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for reading with us today. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon about more of your work. And again, I invite our viewers to check out your work in the Festival Neue Literatur reader, which is online. There will be links in this video. And thank you again.
Thank you.